It all began with Crimea, and it will end with Crimea. Volodymyr Zelenskiy. Hey there, VisualPolitik community. The Crimean peninsula is the real elephant in the room of all the discussions of the Ukrainian war. For years, it was something like the Ibiza of Ukraine. Now it is a real bone of contention. You see, the thing is, the Ukrainians want it back. But it is not at all clear that the United States and Europe will help them in this particular territory. And it's not just us saying this. This is coming from Antony Blinken himself, the US Secretary of State. Check this out.
Antony Blinken warns Ukraine against retaking Crimea. U.S. Secretary of State fears that efforts to reclaim the annexed peninsula would be a red line for Vladimir Putin.
That's right. And why, you might ask? Well, for two reasons. The first is that, at first glance, regaining Crimea seems an impossible mission. The second, and more important, is that Crimea could be reason enough for Putin to press the nuclear button. You see, for the Russians, this peninsula is not even considered a part of Ukraine. It is a separate territory entirely. There is even a well-known song, Stelan v SSSR, made in the USSR, the AliExpress version of the legendary Born in the USA, which starts by saying, Ukraine and Crimea, Belarus and Moldova. That's my country. Only, unlike the Bruce Springsteen track, which, don't forget, is a protest song against America, this one is ultra-nationalist. Ukraine and Crimea, Moldova and Belarus. In other words, in the Russian imagination, Crimea is a distinct territory, a very unique place with its own clearly differentiated status. And they have certain reasons to think so. The Crimean Peninsula has its own history, quite different from that of the rest of Ukraine. From a geopolitical point of view, it is a real bonus prize. You could say that Putin really hit the jackpot in 2014. In fact, it was the only territory that was annexed without any regard. I mean, when the Russians came to Ukraine in 2014, they certainly did not annex the Donbass. At least, not officially. However, the Kremlin considers Crimea to be as Russian as St. Petersburg itself. In short, Kyiv wants Crimea back. Moscow is ready to do anything to prevent it, and Washington is not clear that it will take sides in this case. So in today's video, we're going to ask some very important questions. Firstly, why is Crimea so important for Russia? How could Ukraine get it back? And finally, what scenarios might we expect? Today, we're going to answer all these questions, but first, you know what I'm going to say? Let's look at a little bit of history. But before we do, if you like what we do here at VisualPolitik and you want to contribute to making this project grow and also receive a lot of extra content, you can give us a hand by joining our Patreon community. With very little, you will help us a lot and you will also receive many benefits. I'll leave you the link in the description below. And now, let's get cracking. By now, you probably all have the map of Crimea in your head. Nevertheless, the devil is in the details. So before we get into the history of this territory, let's focus on its geography. The Crimean Peninsula is inhabited by about 2.4 million people. The most important city is Sebastopol, with 547,000 inhabitants. That's where the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Naval Fleet is now located. Controlling this enclave means controlling the entire Sea of Azov and the entire northern Black Sea. In fact, until 2014, Ukraine had 12 operational ports on its coast. For Russia, it means Crimea is vital to have an outlet to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. It is one of its few warm water ports. In addition, its territorial waters have proven gas fields. On the one hand, we have the Skiska fields east of the peninsula, and on the other, those in the Sea of Azov. In this case, it would be relatively easy to exploit this gas because the Azov Sea is the shallowest sea in the world. It does not exceed 15 meters at any point. But the most important thing about Crimea is that it is perfectly protected by its geography. Taking it by sea is mission impossible for Ukraine. Remember that Russia has its entire Black Sea fleet here, and you will probably say, let them take it by land then. But not so fast. I have already told you that the devil is in the details. At first glance, Crimea looks like just another peninsula, but when we approach the isthmus that connects Crimea with Ukraine, we find the devil himself. As you can see, this whole area is full of lakes and marshy areas. Actually, there are only 3 points connecting the peninsula with Ukraine. This you see here is the Pedikop Isthmus, which is between 5 and 7 kilometers wide. Russia has already fortified it with endless trenches and dragon's teeth. On the other side, we have the Khunhar Peninsula, through which passes a highway surrounded by lakes. Again, a very easy entrance to protect. Finally, we have the Arabat Point, another place that the Russians could easily block. In other words, to enter Crimea by land is almost impossible. But could it be possible? Everything is possible in this war, don't forget. At this point, we cannot rule out another coup d'etat in Russia or any other scenario. Even so, entering Crimea would be a military operation as ambitious as the Normandy landings. So now that we have seen the geography, let's get to the history, because believe me, there are many details that we need to understand here.
Land of invasions.
We have seen that Crimea is very difficult to invade. However, throughout history, there have been countless empires that have given it their best shot. The peninsula is of enormous geopolitical importance. In fact, it is no coincidence that the Yalta Conference, which for many was the beginning of the Cold War, was held in Yalta, which is a city that is here in Crimea. Between 1238 and 1449, the peninsula belonged to the Mongol Empire. Then, between 1448 and 1783, it was a Khanate subordinated to the Ottoman Empire. That explains why part of the Crimean Peninsula are so-called Crimean Tartars, who are Muslims. Finally, in 1783, the Russian Empire took advantage of the weakness of the Ottomans to invade this territory. And yes, in this case, they entered the Crimean Peninsula by land. In fact, they tried 3 different campaigns over several years. Did they manage to take it? Yes, but not without paying a very high price. In any case, the Tsars took the territory, which became part of so-called Novorossiya, or New Russia, which included other areas such as Odessa in today's Ukraine. From the very beginning, the Russian Tsars had a problem with the local population. The Tartars were Muslims and did not accept the authority of the Orthodox Christians. So, from Moscow, they adopted their typical strategy: Russify Crimea by sending population from other areas. But wait a moment, because the story doesn't end here. As I told you, Crimea is too juicy to be left uninvaded for long. This is how the so-called Crimean War broke out in 1853. In this case, Russia faced the troops of the Ottomans, the British, and the French. And what role did France and the United Kingdom play in this story? Very simple, they wanted to support the Ottoman Empire, today's Turkey, in order to prevent Russian expansionism. As you can see, Russian expansionism is nothing new. And what seemed to be an impregnable fortress ended up falling to the hands of the English and the French. In this case, they managed to take Sebastopol by sea. Even so, it was a Pyrrhic victory. It turned out that cholera and dysentery ended up killing tens of thousands of soldiers, and Russia ultimately held the territory until 1917. And what happened in 1917, you might ask? Exactly, the Russian Civil War. In this case, the Crimean Tartars took advantage of the instability in Moscow to proclaim the Crimean People's Republic. But this new republic was short-lived. It was soon retaken by the Bolsheviks, and in the following decades, this was a republic within the Russian Federation, which in turn was within the Soviet Union, up until 1941. And so then, what happened in 1941? Well, the Germans invaded again. In this case, the Nazi army entered through the Kerch Strait. But once again, the Soviet troops got it back. This time it was Stalin who made the most typical Moscow move, to Russify the area again. How? By deporting 200,000 Tartars and sending in Russian population from other areas. And you might be wondering, but when did Crimea become part of Ukraine? Well, for that we have to wait until 1954. That's when the then Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, decided that the Crimean Peninsula would be transferred from the Russian Soviet to the Ukrainian Soviet. He did so for a purely logistical reason. The most logical route to send resources to this peninsula goes through Ukraine. So the most logical thing is that this area should be managed from Kyiv. After all, what did it matter? Whether it was Russia or Ukraine, it would still be part of the Soviet Union. At that time, the fall and dissolution of the USSR was obviously not being considered. And that is how Crimea became a favorite holiday destination for Soviet elites. In fact, many high-ranking party officials had a vacation residence in the area. And that brings us to 1991, the year when Ukraine became independent. So, what has happened since then? Well, we're going to take a look at that right now.
The Ibiza of Ukraine.
Let me present to you the Republic of Gaziantep. Calm down, this is not a new country. For years, the Republic of Gaziantep was something like the mother of all raves, a massive beach party that attracted people from all over Europe. Crimea was also the Ibiza of Ukraine. Dreamy beaches, glamorous parties, and at all much cheaper prices than the original Ibiza. And the comparison with Ibiza is not by chance. From the political point of view, Crimea was a kind of island within Ukraine. If you are veteran followers of VisualPolitik, you already know that this country was divided into 2 large populations, Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking. The best evidence of this this are the electoral maps. The areas with more Russian speakers used to be won by the parties closer to the Russian culture and were typically more sensitive to ties with Russia. As you can see, Crimea has always voted for parties that advocate more for ethnic Russians. In this area, almost 95% of the population speaks Russian. And this is noticeable in all elections, both legislative and presidential. All of this explains why the Euromaidan revolts did not go down particularly well in this area. And this is when the famous Little Green Men arrived.
Russian forces in Crimea. Who are they and where did they come from?
In 2014, Russia sent undercover troops to Crimea. They did not carry any flags and therefore they were called the Little Green Men. That is, Russian military invaded Crimea and held a referendum on being annexed to Russia. 95% of the population voted in favor. And at this point, we could ask, was it really a democratic referendum? Obviously not. Now, it is very reasonable to think that a good part of the population was in favor of joining Russia. And of course, those who were not in favor suffered the classic repression by Moscow, with savage tortures included. And you're probably wondering, are people in Crimea now happy to be part of Russia? Well, we're going to look at that now.
The jewel of Putin's empire.
The first thing the Crimeans noticed as soon as they were invaded by the Russians was that the Republic of Gaziantep disappeared. It was the end of raves, and there was a monumental drop in tourism. Those were difficult years for the local economy. Almost all Ukrainian companies supplying the peninsula disappeared overnight, and the sanctions of the West ended up sinking the little business activity that was left. Nevertheless, Putin was clear that Crimea was his #1 priority. Since then, Putin has reverted to the classic Russification strategy. 140,000 Tatars have left Crimea, and in their place, more than 250,000 Russians have arrived. But not only that, since 2014, Moscow has taken resources away from all over the country to send them to Crimea. Yes, it's true, the inhabitants of other parts of Russia will not be very happy with this move, but for Putin, the most important thing was that the Crimean economy did not end up imploding and people turned against him. In total, they have given more than $10 billion in subsidies. But above all, they have managed to push through the most symbolic project of the entire Putin administration, the Kerch Bridge. We are talking about the crown jewel of Russian infrastructure. If you're a long-time followers of VisualPolitik, you already know that Russia has a serious infrastructure problem throughout the country, especially when it comes to bridges. Well, now, Russia can say that it has built the longest bridge in Europe, a feat that, until then, was reserved for the Vasco da Gama Bridge in Lisbon. The Kerch Bridge connects Russia with the Crimean Peninsula over 19 kilometers. That's almost 12 miles of 4-lane road. Up until 2022, it was crossed daily by more than 15,000 cars. The bridge is the umbilical cord linking Crimea with Russia, and it has also given a boost to its economy. But we are not only talking about infrastructure. Moscow has turned this peninsula into a real military fortress. And the question now is, could Ukraine take it back?
Geography, a double-edged sword.
There are more than 130 rivers and streams originating in the Crimean mountains. Yet, this peninsula has been suffering from water shortages for years. We have said that it is an impregnable geographical fortress, but that is also a weakness. The only way to supply Crimea by land is through the roads connecting it to Ukraine or by the Kerch Bridge. Well, both arteries are relatively easy to attack. In fact, they have already been attacked. Check this out.
Kerch Bridge linking Russia to Crimea damaged in explosion.
But that's not all. Do you remember that Crimea is connected with Ukraine by very few points? One such point is the Konar Peninsula, which is almost touching Crimea. Here, there is a small bridge over which a highway passes. So, look what happened.
Ukraine strikes Konar Bridge to Crimea, says Russia.
In both cases, we are talking about very limited attacks. The damage is relatively easy to repair. But they do tell us one thing. They are not 100% safe. That is, from their current position, Ukraine is capable of attacking. Now imagine what would happen if Ukrainian forces approach this area even closer. And you will ask, is that happening? Well, it certainly is. In fact, much of the Ukrainian counteroffensive is focusing precisely on this region. This you see here is the Zaporizhzhia region, which is very close to Crimea. At the time of making this video, Ukrainian troops appeared to be aiming to advance in the direction of Melitopol. If they were to conquer this area, it would be much easier to attack all the arteries connecting Crimea. To do something like that, they would need long-range missiles. In fact, this is one of the reasons why Washington is still reluctant to send such weaponry. But if they end up doing so, these missiles could work like a charm. With this strategy, they cut Crimea off both from the water and other resources. Russia would only be able to supply its precious peninsula by sea, which would make things extremely difficult for them. It is almost impossible to supply fuel and ammunition in large quantities via aircraft. In other words, there is a possibility that Ukraine could leave the Crimeans without resources and just wait for months to pass. Gradually, the troops protecting Crimea would run out of resources to defend themselves. At that point, it would be easier to start a ground attack. Even so, we would still be talking about a brute force operation in the purest D-Day landing style. Ukraine would have to send huge numbers of troops, knowing that it would be sacrificing thousands of lives. Is it possible that we will see this scenario? Yes. Now then, what risks would it entail? The first one is that it is one thing to get through Crimea and another to take it over completely. Remember that we are talking about an area where there has always been a fairly strong Russian sentiment. What's more, for 8 long years, Putin has been in charge of steadily Russifying this area, both with repression and with economic aid, not to mention also sending tens of thousands of settlers. In other words, Crimea is not Kharkiv, and it is quite possible that local people would not welcome Ukrainian troops with open arms. However, it is also quite possible that they will not resist. We have already seen how the Russians of Rostov Del Don did not lift a finger when Wagner's tanks were passing by. The second risk we could face is the one we mentioned at the beginning of this video. If Putin sees that Crimea is about to fall, who knows? Maybe he could push the nuclear button against Ukraine. The question is he really capable of doing something like that? On the one hand, we would be talking about a real challenge, which would have catastrophic consequences, not only because of the West response, but also because of his alliances with China and other countries. On the other hand, given the little control Putin has over his own people, it is not clear whether his generals would obey that order. Given what we have seen, we cannot even be sure that they would not revolt first. This brings up another big question. Can Ukraine actually afford to forget about Crimea? Well, perhaps they could, but it would be difficult. As long as Crimea remains part of Russia, no one will be able to sleep peacefully in Kyiv. Even if they were to sign peace agreements with Russia, Moscow would control the Sea of Azov and could cut off grain exports from such important ports for Ukraine as Mariupol or others, in the event, of course, that they were actually to recover. In addition, Russia would likely maintain a perfect military base to invade Ukraine again, this time from the south. And here we come to the great dilemma of Crimea. It is not in Ukraine's interest for it to remain Russian, but at the same time, recovering it would be very expensive. A last and quite possible scenario is that a special status will be negotiated. That is to say that in a hypothetical peace negotiation, Crimea ends up being an independent and demilitarized republic, neither Russian nor Ukrainian. In any case, now the questions are over to you. Do you think Ukraine will try to take Crimea militarily, or will it end up negotiating a special status for this peninsula? You can leave me your answers in the comments below. And as always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every single week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, so we know. All the best, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.